We are live on YouTube, and I am going to hit record now. We are live on YouTube, and I am going to hit record now. We are live on YouTube, and I am going to hit.
Shall we start?
Hello, all. Thank you so much for joining us for Research Bites. My name is Alejandra Paz, and I'm the Multimedia and Marketing Assistant for the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, aka CSRPC. So, the monthly Research Bites series is one of many programs that we have initiated to engage scholars, students, staff, and community members in interdisciplinary scholarship and programming around topics of race and ethnicity. Our goal for this series is to connect staff from across the university with faculty affiliates of the center who study, teach, and write about race and ethnicity. We wanted to create an informal and interactive space where staff can learn firsthand about some of the exciting research happening on campus, as well as get to know more faculty. We also hope these gatherings provide an opportunity for faculty and staff to network with the hopes of shared interests and possibilities for future collaborations. You can subscribe to our Research Bites and CSRPC list servers. The link will be shared in our chat to be notified of future conversations. So today we are joined by a very special guest, Eman Abdelhadi. Eman is a sociologist and assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. She is a scholar of gender, religion, and migration who specializes in studying U.S. Muslim communities. Her work has appeared in Social Forces, Gender and Society, and SOCUS, and her manuscript, Impossible Futures, Why Women Lead Muslim American Communities, is forthcoming with the University of Chicago Press. Her scholarship has been featured in the Associated Press, NPR, and the Washington Post. Eman also writes a column on U.S. politics for In These Times magazine, along with M.E. O'Brien. She is a co-author of the revolutionary science fiction novel Everything for Everyone, in Oral History of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072, which came out in 2022 with Common Ocean Press and has been translated into French and Catalan. So please give a warm welcome to our friend and faculty member, Eman Abdelhadi.
Thank you so much, Alex, and Tracy and Tara for inviting me. It's exciting to be here with presenting through a space that I love so much and has been such an enriching part of my 7 years here at the university. So, I am giving a very informal version of my book talk, basically talking through this book that I'm finishing up called Impossible Futures: Why Women Leave American Muslim Communities. That the next draft is due in July 1st. So if you have major edits, keep them to yourself. I'm just kidding. I'm working on it. So yeah, and I want to keep this as informal as possible. We're a relatively small group, so I want to say, I have a lot of slides in here. I'm not going to go through all of them, and I'm going to think about some of them as almost like a buffet offering and see like what folks are excited to scoop into. So feel free to kind of stop me at any point. Feel free to drop in to the chat with questions to unmute and however you want to do this. I heard from Tara that y'all are a fan, or people have been a fan of baby pictures in this. So these aren't quite baby pictures, but I figured I would tell you the story of how I arrived at this research question through my own trajectory. So this is little tiny me at various stages of being tiny. And basically, the long long story short, I grew up in a very, very tight-knit Muslim community in a Muslim, in a, very practicing religious Muslim household. So this first extremely fobby picture, if you know, you know what I mean by fobby picture on the left is me as a child in Egypt before we moved to the US when I was 9. Um, and I think this was also similarly like I'm probably like 7 in this middle photo. And then I, like all the women in my family, put on hijab early. I think I put it on when I was 9 because I thought I was trying to be cool and all my friends were wearing it. And my mom was like, "That seems young. Are you sure?" And I was like, "Yeah, totally. I'm a big girl now." And I think I'm like maybe 11 or 12 in this photo on the right, little pudgy 12-year-old. And by then I'd moved to the US and was part of this really intensive Muslim community, really tight-knit Muslim community. And by that, I mean that I spent every Friday night at the mosque. I spent all of my weekends at Quran school. I hung out almost entirely with Muslims. I think the first time I was in a non-Muslim person's house was late in high school, maybe my junior or senior year. Um, I was extremely, extremely what I call embedded in this community. And as I got older and I went to college in Michigan and then went to grad school in New York. And as I got older, I realized, well, wait, there are all these people who are Muslim like me, but don't have this same kind of embeddedness and commitment to these communities. And in fact, I started to think about how in my own childhood, there were all these people that I would see as a child that kind of slowly disappeared over time, right? That there was this core group of us that stayed in the mosque, right? Middle school, high school, college, that remained like very much all Muslim all the time. And there were other folks on the peripheries of this community. Okay, funny story. This picture, I am the person on the left, was a poster at Customs and Border Control at several major American airports for a long time and remains one of the photos that is shown in the like Customs and Border Control like video that they play on the screens as you're waiting to see your immigration officer. So I am literally a poster child for America, which I find, which is so funny if you know anything about me at all. And yeah, and this was because our hometown had all these journalists. It was Columbia, Missouri is this town with a ton of journalists because it has this journalism school. And so at some point, some journalism student came and was like, "Can we do this photo essay with you?" And took this photo of me and my friend Hind, and apparently later sold it to like the State Department or something, or it won some kind of essay. And it became so at some point in my life, people were like, "I saw you at LAX. I saw you in JFK." And I was like, "What?" So yeah, so that's a fun fact. But here I am in front of my childhood mosque in Columbia, Missouri, where my parents got married, where my sister got married, where I one time kind of got married. LOL, story for later. And where I spent, which this was really my second home. This is where I spent all of my time as a kid. So, okay, how much is this a question that's not just about my life, but is actually a question more broadly? So this is some data from the Pew Research Center's surveys of Muslim Americans that were conducted. I pulled the data from 2007, 2011, 2017, which are the available years. And people are asked, how many of your close friends are Muslim? And what you see is that the community is basically split. Right? You have like about half the people say all or most of them, and about half the people are some, hardly, none, right? And so you can already see in the kind of survey data that there's a split on what we might call embeddedness, people's level of engagement with other Muslims, right? Here's another kind of piece of evidence towards that, which is mosque attendance. Of course, mosque attendance could be a sign of religiosity. We could also think about it as, mosques are these social centers. Like I told you, this mosque that I showed you a second ago, I spent all my time there playing pool, reading books, going to school. So how much people attend the mosque isn't just about prayers, it's also about how much they're embedded in the community. And again, you see that there's kind of a split halfway. So Jummah, the second category, is Friday prayers, which is when like mosques have services. About half of the people are going to the mosque once a week or more, and about half are going much less frequently. Eid is the holiday. It happens twice a year, right? So you have a big chunk of people right here, if we combine these bars, that are going twice a year or less to the mosque, right? So again, what we're getting is a picture of a community that's pretty split on how engaged it is. Now, okay, I go to grad school and I'm like, all right, let me read all the books on American Muslims. This is a picture of my actual shelf in Rosenwald. You can come by and see me anytime. I'll make you a cup of tea. And you can see that this shelf of books on Muslim Americans, and these are all incredible studies, most of which are qualitative studies of Muslim communities that start with the mosque or the Muslim Student Association or MSA, or an ethnic enclave. Now, the problem with studying Muslims that way is that you don't get to see who's not in the room, right? We don't know who, you can't really answer the question that I'm posing, which is why do some people stay and some people go? If you're only studying the people who stay. So I set out to study the people who go. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how I do that in a second. But let me kind of set out some definitions. So I've already talked about embeddedness, which is basically, which I think of as the centrality of Muslims to a person's social life, right? So how much are other Muslims the kind of core of your social life? And I try to think about what people's trajectories of embeddedness are, right? So how involved were they at different points in their lives? So I find that embeddedness in Muslim communities fluctuates across the life course, right? In my own life, as I told you, I was super embedded. I was one of the what they called the masjid kids, the mosque children, like those kids that were at the mosque all the time. And eventually in grad school, I start to kind of move away and have other centers to my social world. I also think about embeddedness as distinct from identity or religiosity. So I want to make clear that what I'm interested in isn't really like how much are people's belief in God changing or how much if they pray changes. I'm more interested in their social relationship with the Muslim community. Now, those things are related, right? So I do find in the study that like it's really hard to maintain religiosity in the long term if you've left the community, right? Islam is very much a communal religion. Identity is a separate thing, right? Many people identify as Muslim, even if they are not necessarily practicing, not necessarily believing, not necessarily hanging out with other Muslims. It's a racialized identity. It's an affiliation identity. So, and we see that with other groups, like, for example, think about cultural Catholics or secular Jews, right? There are many kind of categories that might persist even outside of embeddedness. And the main story that I find in the book is that there's this huge gender difference in the trajectories of embeddedness. So where women were more likely to depart over time and men were more likely to do something that I term detour. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means. And ultimately, I argue that women's departure, so I spend the book trying to explain why it is that we see this difference between women and men, where women are leaving and men are having these kind of in and out, but ultimately in relationships. And I argue that women's departures are an unintended consequence of a gendered burden of reproduction, wherein women are tasked with holding the moral and cultural boundaries of the Muslim community. So what I mean by that is, what I find is that Muslims are very stressed out about the future, are very stressed about whether they are going to be able to reproduce Islam across generations. And when there is stress about the future, it often falls on women's shoulders, and that's true of many communities. In part because women are expected to do the work of not just the physical reproduction, but the cultural and religious reproduction, right? They are supposed to raise the next generation of Muslim kids. They are the metric of whether the community is holding on to its values, its culture, etc. And that places this intensive pressure on women in multiple environments, from the home to the mosque to the marriage market. And it effectively creates this self-fulfilling prophecy where women are pressured out of the community and their exit is seen as, foreshadowing of a failed future. So I'll talk more about that, but I wanted to give you kind of a heads up of what the argument is going to be. So let me introduce you to kind of concretize this a little bit. Let me introduce you to two of my respondents in this study. The first one I call Sana, and I'm going to read you a little bit about Sana. Sana was 34 when I met her. She was married. She's South Asian. And Sana was 12 years old when her mom, in her words, went crazy. The trigger was Sana's period, which arrived unceremoniously that year. Suddenly, what she wore, who she spent time with, where she went, all became of great concern to her mother, who went to extraordinary lengths to monitor her behavior. Eventually, friends nicknamed her house Alcatraz. The change took Sana by surprise because her parents had never actually been that religious. Her dad's recreational drinking was an open secret. Her mom only prayed during Ramadan. Sana had gone to Islamic school as a child and had many Muslim friends, but religion itself was never the focus of the relationships. Yet religion was one of the ways Sana's parents justified the lockdown, along with their culture as Pakistani immigrants and a certain amount of frustrated because I said so. Unconvinced, Sana fought them constantly and found creative ways to do what she wanted to do. College was the perfect chance to get away. She only applied to schools far from her parents' New York. In fact, she ended up all the way in California. This was the beginning of a slow departure from Muslim communities. At college, the MSA turned her off by appearing too strict. Her occasional trips to the mosque were marred by gender segregation and a policing of her clothing that reminded her all too readily of being at her parents' house. In dating, she avoided Muslim men, settling into a serial monogamy that ended when she married David, a white atheist man. So let's contrast Sana with another respondent, very similar age, also South Asian, named Asif. I think of Asif as a detour. So Asif, also South Asian, grew up in a similar suburban environment as Sana, but his family was a lot more religious. He attended Islamic school for longer, went to the mosque more frequently. His parents prayed regularly throughout the year, never touched alcohol or pork. When he reached adolescence, Asif, like Sana, wanted to experiment with the artifacts of middle-class suburban teenage life. He started attending parties, tried his first alcohol, and even acquired a girlfriend. His parents pretended not to notice. He came home drunk sometimes, but they were not going to, in his words, rock the boat or whatever. This went on for years, but did not seem to affect his ties to his hometown mosque. Asif still attended congregational Friday prayers with his father every week. He commuted to college after home since it was easier not to have to do his own laundry or worry about rent. I'm going to let you guess who did the laundry. After graduating, Asif sought professional connections to facilitate entry into an elite MBA program. He found these connections in the Muslim community, specifically a Muslim young professionals group called Muppies. Inspired by this new circle of friends, he started attending mosque more frequently and took up daily prayer again. Slowly, he gave up drinking. I was shaping up, he tells me. After the MBA, it was time to settle down. He had dated, quote, mostly white girls until that point, implying they were not Muslim. Now, Asif turned towards Muslim dating apps and his mom's friends to find a Muslim spouse. Having become more religious himself, he sought out someone who was also practicing. So Asif and Sana represent the two trajectories of embeddedness that I want to focus on here, that I focus on in the book, which is a departure where Sana slowly leaves the community over time, and a detour where you experiment for a while and then you come on back when you're ready to adult. How did I find these people? So this is one of the things where I'm offering this as a buffet offering, and we can get into the details if people want. But basically, I focused on second and 1.5 generation people who grew up Muslim, who are not converts, because I was interested in the role of childhood. I focused on one cohort, 30 to 45-year-olds at the time. I wanted them to be far enough in their life that I could kind of see where they landed. but not so old that I couldn't find them because it's a pretty young community and these were second generation people. So I did these life history interviews with 80 folks. From Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. And importantly, instead of starting with a mosque or a Muslim Student Association, um, I took a random sample of a voter targeting, of a list of people with likely Muslim names from a voter targeting firm. So there are these global algorithms where they try to figure out where people are from based on their names, and there's sort of a global Muslim algorithm, a Muslim name algorithm, and I sent people letters, made phone calls, etc., to try to get them. This is not a perfect sampling technique, but it doesn't necessarily sample on the dependent variable, which is embeddedness. So I do these really crazy long interviews, these life history interviews that try to trace out the phases of people's lives and the things that I'm interested in, transcribe them, code them, etc. So what I end up with is this is a chart that kind of summarizes these trajectories of embeddedness. So this first panel is childhood. These are, big kind of buckets here. So I find that 7% of the people that I interview are peripheral in childhood, meaning they didn't go to the mosque. Mostly these were children of mixed marriages or really secular parents. And there were folks who their parents were not interested in taking them and hanging out with other Muslims, and their kids weren't hanging out with other Muslims. I find those people pretty much stay peripheral to Muslim communities throughout their lives. They might have a kind of nominal, like Muslim identity. They're like, oh, I'm Muslim, but they're not practicing, they're not embedded. Most kids, though, were children of immigrants who hung out mostly with their parents' circle of other Muslims. And what I find is that most of these people end up in adolescence and early adulthood in these experimental pathways, right? So they end up kind of experimenting as they get older. They start making their own friends. They start having a social life outside of the Muslim community. Um, and and then there's this group that is basically all Muslim all the time, kind of like the way I grew up, right? And those folks generally stay embedded into adulthood. So the real story of the book is in this experimental group and how it divides out into these deep departures, right? People who kind of don't come back and slowly drift away, and the people who detour, come back in adulthood. And importantly, so each of these columns corresponds to one of the rows in the previous slide, right? So these are the consistently peripheral people. These are the departures. These are the detours. These are the consistently embedded people. And really the key finding that the book starts with is that there's this big difference between men and women, right? So whereas 50% of women are departures compared to 28% of men, right? Only 18% of women are detours compared to 47% of men. So an almost kind of flip in the tendency here, right? So why? Why are women leaving more than men? What I find is that effectively, both men and women have this kind of cultural contestation in adolescence and early adulthood. This is when they start to like compartmentalize and have different groups of friends and start to experiment. And for women, what they experience as they are starting this compartmentalization is intensive monitoring, both by parents and the community, this intensive conflict over this fact that they are starting to branch out. And that conflict leads them to seek out distance, right? We saw with Sana, she's like, I'm leaving this state. In fact, I'm going all the way to California to get away from you people, right? And this distance just builds and builds and builds over time with the community itself. So this is kind of an outline of the book as it stands right now. You have basically in the first chapter, I explain what I just explained to you, that there are these different trajectories for men and women. And then chapters 2, 3, 4, and 2, 3, and 4 explain why it is that we end up with these different trajectories. And I argue that it starts in the home. It starts with how parents treat boys versus girls, this intensive monitoring of girls, this kind of boys will be boys attitude towards boys, this double standard that emerges, and that then I argue that this double standard is reproduced by the major institutions of the community, mainly mosques, Islamic schools, MSAs, and the marriage market. In chapter 5, I talk about what it's like for women after they've left. And importantly, I think there's a version of this book, there's a lot of migration scholarship that's along the form of like assimilation theory. It's like, oh, it's great. Everyone kind of moves out of their cultural and religious communities and they meld into the crowd and it's wonderful. Or a certain kind of Islamophobic perspective that, will like, these women have liberated themselves from the shackles of this oppressive faith. And that's not quite the story that I'm telling here, because what I find is mostly women did not exit because they wanted to. They exited because they were pushed out, because it felt impossible to stay. And that's where the impossible futures thing comes from. And that, in fact, exit comes with a lot of grief and anxiety and ambivalence. They are not exiting the Muslim community into the arms of a welcoming society. They're exiting into the arms of a society that remains Islamophobic, remains, suspicious of them, and is not able to really incorporate them. And so there's a great sense of loss in all of this. So let's think about why this double standard exists throughout these institutions that causes this problem. I want to give you this quote from one of my respondents, because one of the things people go to immediately is to say, oh, this is about religiosity. There's something about Islam as a religion that is unequal, that is unequal towards women versus men. So interestingly, I think this quote kind of captures why I don't think this is the case. She says, there was no requirement in my house to pray. There was no requirement to fast. But I think for my dad was afraid that I was going to lose my culture living in the US. He was afraid I was going to lose my religion and that I was just going to be an American. And that's, I think, what he didn't want. So it was more like a cultural thing than I think a religious thing. And I think that's kind of borne out throughout the data, which is the interesting thing is I don't find that actually the more religious parents are more unequal between men and women. More religious parents were kind of strict with both sons and daughters because for them it was about like God and your relationship with God and whether you were following the rules. And they were equally concerned about the sort of moral welfare of their sons as their daughters. They might not have been able to exert as much control over boys as they did over girls, but there was like an equal kind of concern. Whereas for this kind of for less religious parents, it seemed primarily symbolic what girls did, right? There was this concern that that if they didn't follow certain rules, right, that all was lost for the future. And those quote captures this, but in such a general pattern that we see. So over and over, this is where I sort of come to the argument about the burden of cultural reproduction, the sense that if girls strayed, right, there was kind of no future, no possibility of reproducing Muslimness across generations. It also didn't seem to be about ethnicity. So whereas like, Arab parents and South Asian parents seem to be worried about slightly different things, like they might have different preferences for clothing, they both equally had this gender inequality in their treatment. I want to give you another example that I think illustrates this point that it's not really about religion. So this is a longer quote, but I think it's worthwhile, from this respondent that I called Dina. She says, my father said a lot of things were haram or religiously forbidden, which later on I learned to not necessarily be true. For instance, he said it was haram to cut our hair. And I confronted him about that when I was in my early 20s, when I just decided to chop it off one day. Because we went to a sheikh's house. A sheikh is a religious authority. And I said, his wife, her hair is really short. My dad said, just because she's the wife of a sheikh, it doesn't mean she's doing it right. I said, but he's really religious. Like he gives sermons and stuff. Why would his wife do something wrong? And my dad said, no, it's haram. It's forbidden. And I remember I confronted him about it and we kept arguing. And I said, where is the rule that says it's haram? Where's the rule? And after we argued for like 10 minutes and it got really heated, he just said, my mother had long hair and I love long hair and I don't want you guys to cut it. And I flipped out. I said, I don't care what you do, but do not say that something is haram. I couldn't even. The words were barely coming out of my mouth because I was just so upset. I said, don't make things haram because you want them to be. Like, if Islam doesn't say it's haram, then it's not haram. And then we got into similar arguments on various other subject matters that I fought him on. So growing up, I always said, when I turn 18, I'm going to become Catholic. I said, they're allowed to do things. They eat Skittles. They eat Jello. They can wear whatever they want. Um, so in this story, right, we see this anxiety about the unrecognizability of the future as it is symbolized by women's bodies, by what women are doing, right, by how they're dressing, how they cut their hair. And it's coded in the language of religion. Religion becomes this easy kind of thing to grab for, to justify these anxieties. Um, and similarly, you see that she has this idea that the other world, right? Like Catholics that are out here, she's thinking about Catholics as the kind of example of the permissive other, right? So okay, so if we're like, all right, this is what parents were doing in the home, why aren't women coming back, right? Why don't they just come back after they're grown-ups, right, and form their own relationships? And what I argue in chapters 3 and 4 is that this dynamic isn't just in the home, it's recreated by other Muslim institutions. So I asked women extensively about their relationships with the mosque. This is Sahra Ahmed, who was actually a chaplain at Northwestern for a while. And she has this picture that she posted on this blog called Side Entrance, which was a place where people posted kind of annoying things that happened at the mosque. And the sign says women are required to abide by Islamic dress code at all times. Violators will be asked to leave the premises of the mosque. Please dress modestly, wear non-transparent scarf to cover all hair, avoid tight, revealing, transparent clothes. Now, I want to note that men also have an Islamic dress code, and they have a dress code for prayer. And never would you see a sign like this on the men's side saying, don't wear tight pants. Men are not supposed to wear tight pants, actually, in like Muslim tradition, right? And so this intensive policing, so over and over and over, almost every single woman that I asked about the mosque brought up some instance, some experience of how her body felt in the space, how her clothing was monitored. And I asked people about this, and this is a methodological point. I don't ask people like, was your body monitored in the space? I just ask them like, what was the mosque like? Tell me about your experience in the mosque. And women would spontaneously bring this up over and over. Only in one interview with one man in the entire study did any man ever mention his clothes being commented on. And he was so mad about it, he almost got into a physical fight because he went to this mosque and this guy told him, oh, you should be wearing a kufi. And he was like, don't tell me what to do. And they got into like nearly a physical altercation. So there's such a strong contrast, right? So for women, the mosque often felt like this space of anxiety, this space of monitoring, this space that you had to plan a lot for. A couple of quotes, one respondent, Lubaba, says, of course, all the women were, I asked her to describe the mosque near her house, she said, the women were all stuck in some basement. You can't even hear the sermon. All the kids are running around. What's the point? It's not even like I can concentrate on prayer. You can't get anything out of it. I don't go. Another woman, I asked her about a mosque near her house, and she said, no, I don't know if I asked her if she goes there. She said, I don't know if there's any accommodation for women. And then she's like, I heard that there is, but the last time I tried to go, it was pouring rain, and the man at the gate looked at me like I was Satan. So I just decided to keep going and not go to the mosque that day. So often women don't even know if there's a space for them, whereas men are always sure that the mosque is there to serve them, is available to them. This inequality reproduces this idea that women are being monitored, that there's this different standard for them in the community. On the other hand, men had a very different experience of the mosque. So, to give you an example, this one respondent that I call Kamal, he says, it was funny because I used to hang out with my very secular friends. We used to have a lot of fun and go out and do whatever. And the next day, the MSA, the Muslim Student Association guys, would ask me to give the sermon. And I always had to decline it. But just having the ability to be comfortable with both and make everyone comfortable is definitely a skill set that I was able to hone. So men often thought of their ability to come in and out of Muslim spaces and to have kind of friends that were religious and friends that were secular, to go to the club on Thursday and to the mosque on Friday as a personal skill, which we see over and over as like a form of privilege, is that people see their privilege as a sign of like a personal asset as opposed to a sign of a systematic privilege. Um, and Finally, you have the same kind of dynamic reproduced in the marriage market. So this is a this app has rebranded itself. It used to be called Minder, Muslim Tinder, to swipe, match, and marry. But it has reproduced, it's now called Salam's app, and it has some hilarious ads on the subways in London and New York. And I think one of them says, arrange your own marriage, which I think is really hilarious. But basically, what I find is the Muslim marriage market similarly has different standards. Like all marriage markets has different standards for men and for women. So I won't get too deep into the examples, right? Well, I don't know. I want to make sure that we get to well, okay, so men would often start out casually dating pretty early, mostly non-Muslim women. And then once they were ready to sort of adult, to settle down, they would come back, like our friend Asif from the beginning, and try to pursue serious relationships with Muslim women. So Abbas, for example, he's Shia and of Iranian origin. He is currently married to a woman of the same background. And then when I asked him if he had any significant relationships before the marriage, he said, yeah, just a few in college here and there, but nothing crazy. I asked if they were mostly Muslim women. He said, no, my relationship beforehand was with an Iranian girl. She was Muslim, but she wasn't particularly practicing or a religious person. I asked why they broke up, and he said different reasons. I mean, a lot of it was probably because of me. I'm sort of a late bloomer, and a lot of it was just for fun. I was never really pursuing anybody seriously. And I said, did you have a sense of who would be an ideal partner at that point, or who was someone you could take seriously? And he said, obviously, you want someone who comes from a family that's educated. You want someone who has the same culture and values, especially you're Muslim, things like that. So somebody obviously who gets along with my family. And I said, so the person being Muslim and from a similar culture, that's important to you, like being Iranian? He says, yes. And he says, family was important to me, and having someone who has the same background and can get along with my family. So he had dated women non-seriously who didn't fit these criteria of being religious, being people that his family would see as practicing enough Muslims, as culturally appropriate. And then once he's like, okay, I'm ready to grow up an adult. And you saw this over and over with men in the sample, is that once they were ready to adult, they were ready for the kind of practicing Muslim life. Women had very different, because of the kind of social sanctions to dating, a lot of them stayed off the dating market for a very long time. They eventually would start to attempt to pursue Muslim men. These often didn't go well for various reasons. And then you had one pathway where people would give up on Muslim men and start pursuing serious relationships with non-Muslims. Again, this is for the kind of experimental group, the consistently embedded group, just married other Muslims. So what I find is that over time, women were able to make peace with their families and to make peace with their own exits, but they weren't able to make peace with the Muslim community. So there wasn't this moment of sort of return. So this one respondent told me about how her parents had helped her move in with her partner. And despite having, when she was much younger, saying, I would never, her dad had said, I would never talk to you if you ever lived with someone without being married. You would lose me, I would disown you. And then 10 years later, he's helping her move in with her non-married partner, right? So there was this kind of like this adjustment that happened on the family level that never really happened on the community level. So to kind of sum up, I find that women's distances from the Muslim community increase over time. There's an eventual peace settlement with parents, but not with Muslim communities, and there's grief over lost community and a desire for connection with other Muslims. Men have this return or continued compartmentalization, so they either come back and realign their life around the kind of normative Muslim life, or they continue to kind of have separate spaces for their Muslim and non-Muslim parts. And then they adult by kind of settling down. The key difference, right, is that men are ultimately leading the lives that they thought they would lead. The lives that when they were kids were kind of set out for them by their parents and elsewhere. Women had these major ruptures where there was this idea of the life that you were supposed to lead and this kind of inability to ever get there. That I think was very kind of disruptive and difficult for many people. And then um, there's a question here of like, is this specifically a Muslim story? And I think in some ways it's not. It's generally the case that women are held up as the holders of moral boundaries, right? Like we think about the culture wars in the US and this kind of obsession with abortion, this obsession with fertility, there's this constant kind of return to what women are doing as the kind of symbol of where the culture is going, where the community is going. It's also true that other research on migrant communities shows that this idea of like gendered and sexual moral boundaries as the main divider between immigrant communities and the broader community is a recurrent theme. So there's this famous paper by Luspirito on Filipino women that's called "We Don't Sleep Around Like White Girls Do," right? That's like basically this idea that that the main kind of moral difference, right, between this migrant community and everyone else is about gender and sexual behavior and women's sexual behavior. So I think that we do see women bearing the burden of cultural reproduction in many contexts. And this is the kind of one community's version of this gender inequality. Now, what is Muslim about this story is that I think Muslims are under even more pressure than many other communities. There's even more of a sense that this is the main boundary with American society because of the whole kind of Orientalist narrative. Muslims are also under enormous state and broader pressure because of Islamophobia. This is a generation that grew up in the shadow of 9/11. There's a lot of reason to worry about the future of Muslim communities. This is a community that is very stressed out about the possibility of reproduction over time. And so I think that intensifies some of these dynamics. And I have a paper using the same data on what I call the Orientalist gaze, the sense that you're being watched for your gendered behavior because, of the kind of idea that Muslims are uniquely patriarchal and evil and oppressive to women. So this becomes part of the mix. Okay, I'm gonna stop here. Yeah, I'm excited to hear your questions. I have some extra, yeah, I'm happy to take this wherever folks want to go. Tracy.
I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you. This is very interesting and just reminds me of a lot of conversations in Black communities about, you know, marriageable mates and, I'm wondering like what are the numbers is there any kind of gendered class imbalance or balance in the numbers of people seeking heterosexual partners? Like there's a sense that in Black communities that there are more Black women who have achieved middle class status than there are Black men for them to date and marry. That's one question. And then the other question is, were you able to gather any data on queer Muslims and how this fits into the story?
Yeah, thank you. There were like a handful of queer Muslims in the study. And I think they, interestingly, like the queer women in the study, uh, all like left their parents and like I had a gay man in the study who was like literally out to his parents but living with them and having this kind of like perpetual don't ask don't tell dynamic, which to me was so interesting because I was like, wow, even a gay man can get away with so much more than women can in a sense. And I mean, I think you can't really. I mean, I don't know how much I can generalize from that because I just didn't have enough queer people in the study to be able to really like say major differences. But I think we definitely saw similar. I definitely saw similar kind of gender dynamics, like in how parents treated them, at least growing up. Um, yeah, definitely men had a bigger pool of partner options than women did. Um, so in my sample, and I wish I had an extra slide on this, but for some reason I don't. But I was just like scrolling through some of my backup slides. But in this sample, I find that women marry out more than men do. And I talk about it as a paradox because technically, like religiously, the idea is that men are allowed to marry non-Muslim women and women are not allowed to marry non-Muslim men, like according to kind of orthodox interpretations of the faith. And so a lot of women, had their partners kind of convert, like nominally. But I think what I found is that and so it might be confusing because it's like, okay, well, if these men are seeking religious women and Muslim women, like why aren't they seeking? But I think two things expanded the pool for men is one, men were not stuck to the same age range. Like women often wanted partners that were their age or older. And whereas men were willing to date women who were much, much younger. And men had the ability to kind of import spouses from overseas in a way that women couldn't because again the status differential, right? It's more acceptable for men to marry women with like kind of lower status credentials than for women to marry lower status men. And we know this from marriage markets in general. It's not unique to Muslims, like you said, Tracy. Like we see it in other. It's part of what like this kind of studies of the Black community show this, right? Whenever you have this kind of education inequality. I don't have I mean, I've looked at the survey data on like levels of educational attainment, and there doesn't seem to be as much of a gap in educational attainment between men and women within the Muslim community. There is some, and I think it's higher in the second generation than in the first generation. And that has to do with like migration dynamics and all this. But I think it's really, I think that part of the problem was also a difference in cultural expectations. So women would like complain that men had like had these experimental phases, had dated, had done all these things, but then wanted women who were much more conservative or hadn't had the same pathways, right? So, and I saw this in the way that men talked about potential partners when I talked to them, right? So men really understood that they actually couldn't, many of them, they wanted Muslim lives and they wanted Muslim children, importantly, like children who would be raised Muslim, and they knew that they wouldn't be able to do that work. And so it was very clear to them that they needed a Muslim wife in order to do that. And that kind of redirected their choices, but then also their sense of like, who is that Muslim wife, right? If you don't have a problematized view of this idea of like what the future is supposed to look like, then you kind of want a Muslim wife that looks a lot like what you grew up with, right? And these women couldn't reproduce that as people who had grown up here. And so there was this major kind of, I think there is a crisis. And anecdotally in the community, there's a lot of conversation about the kind of Muslim, like the marriage crisis, the partnership crisis in the Muslim community. And I think this just showed one aspect of how that happened. Okay, there's a question in the chat. Thank you, Eman. As you were speaking, I thought that this was a similar story to the group I grew up as part of in the peripheral trajectory as part of a broader South Asian Hindu Jain communities. I appreciate you noting this in the end portion of your talk, and I see this to be part of a broader discussion problem of in and out groups, who is or is not a real American, and how that can be removed in an instant using descriptors of religion, ethnicity, race. Did any of your interviewees discuss concerns of marrying in or out of the community, and how this could affect one's safety and well-being or acceptance within a broader society? Yeah, so definitely there was. So thank you for that question and for that connection. I'm always happy to hear when people are like, "Oh, this is similar to other communities," and like that's I think that this is why this is relevant even for folks who aren't interested in Muslims in particular. Um, yeah, I think in terms of marrying in and out of the community, I guess it's similar to what I was just saying, is that like there was this concern of like arch, we are not gonna if we're all marrying out, right, then like is do we have a Muslim future? And parents certainly had this concern. And the respondents themselves had that concern. And this sense that like I think for some of the women, whereas when men were like, oh, I want to marry someone who's more religious than me or more connected than me so that they can help pull me in, um, that was more possible for them, right? Whereas women would often cite the same aspiration of like, oh, I wish I could marry like somebody whose religiosity could help me become more religious or be me more embedded. But men didn't tend to opt for women who were more peripheral than they were. So it was kind of like this asymmetric aspiration. Um, and in terms of like broader acceptance by society, I think there was this sense, I think a lot about one respondent who said, who was not practicing, is disembedded and kind of is fine with it. And she says, well, my last name is like, she's like, I still identify as Muslim and I'll always identify as Muslim and I want my kids to identify as Muslim. And she's like, my last name is like a tattoo. She's like, you are still Muslim whether you like it or not. Like Muslim is not just a chosen identity. It's an identity that's also placed on you by society. If your last name is Muhammad or Rahman or anything that's identifiably Muslim, people are going to treat you as Muslim. And that's regardless of whether you're practicing or not. And so I think there was always this kind of concern about what the future, what that looked like. To be in the broader society. You're welcome.
Well, I'll have another question if nobody else does.
Yeah.
And this is kind of back to the more personal level, but just kind of wondering if you care to share how you see yourself in this whole um, situation. So have you departed? Have you,
Yeah.
where are you on this trajectory?
I think actually this relates to your previous question about queer Muslim communities, because I think that there is this sliver of people who was able to detour back, but not to the same type of Muslim community, but to a kind of alternative version. Are these like, I think more and more there are these like alternative Muslim spaces that are specifically trying to be different than the traditional mosque, and try to kind of offer some ability to connect with the faith that isn't tied to a lot of these anxieties and these restrictions. So I think for me, I do kind of think of myself as a detour more so than a departure. And, a lot of my social life is very Muslim, but it's definitely not. It's less Muslim, it's not less tied to mainstream Muslim institutions. So it's less tied to the mosque. I do go to the mosque, but it's less centered around the mosque and more centered around these kind of like alternative community spaces that are, centered around political values, or like, I know there are things in Chicago like an abolitionist Muslim reading group, or like, a queer Muslim like group, or all of these like alternative spaces. Some of respondents talked about political, like Muslim kind of coded political spaces, or like Palestine organizing, as these spaces that reintroduce a lot of Muslims in their lives, but on very different terms than the terms offered by mainstream institutions. And I think increasingly we're seeing more and more of that, more and more of these spaces pop up and more uptake of them. But I think that they remain quite small. And I think that, especially for people who are more mainstream in there. Like it's easy for someone like me who's like a leftist and queer and all these things to be like to kind of like, but a lot of the folks that are getting pushed out of these communities are not necessarily very heterodox in their views, are not necessarily leftist, are not queer, are not, but they're just not being served by the kind of mainstream institutions. So I have a lot of, I mean, I'm someone who I have a lot of love for the Muslim community, and I have a lot of love for the spaces I grew up in, even the kind of really mainstream spaces. And I have a preface in the book where I talk about this moment, at this open house in the mosque where I grew up, where it was, the open house. It was the day that like all the non-Muslims were visiting, and this was like the height of the kind of post 9/11 don't hate us, we're not terrorists phase. And I went into the men's side of the mosque for the first time in my life. Because I was like one of the speakers. And I stood there and I was like facing the women's side, which is in the back, for the first time. And I saw that there was this calligraphy on the back of the wall that I had never seen before and didn't know existed. That was like just a few feet from where I had prayed my whole life, right? And this kind of feeling of um, the community being both intensely mine and also not mine, right? And so, I don't write this book from a place of condemnation, or it's more from a place of love and a place of like things could be better, things could be different. None of this is inherent about Islam. None of this is inevitable. I think we all we can build better Muslim communities. So yeah.
Thank you.
Hmm.
All right. It looks like we're basically at time. If nobody has any other questions, then thank you so much for giving this talk today, man.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was so fun to do this, and feel free to reach out anytime if anybody wants to grab coffee or have any questions. I'm always around. Yeah. Thank you for organizing.
Thank you. All right.
Right.
Have a good day.
All